welcome. If you seek truth, the truth shall set you free. Fear not. And now the agenda with Crystal Risotti.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Agenda with Crystal Risotti. I'm the host Crystal, and I'm so happy to see you here tonight. I hope that this video and the episode so far have touched you and you might have learned something or shared it with other people who may need to learn the information. If you haven't checked out the other episodes, I want to encourage you to do so, because at this point in time, each one that comes subsequently is going to build on the ones before. So just be sure and check out all the videos up to this point. Tonight, we're going to talk about gender ideology, and that's a huge topic to dive into, especially in the current culture today. All the episodes so far, we've been talking about different things that affect our culture and sharing from a biblical perspective how we should view it and how we should be dealing with it. And at the end, sharing some things that we can actually do to prevent it or work towards eradicating it if it's not a good thing and promoting it if it's a good thing. So up till now, we've been talking about the United Nations, the communist goals, the global economy, global education. And tonight we're going to be talking about gender ideology. So I want to make sure that you understand that tonight we're going to be talking about a lot of information that's foundational. The next episode, I believe I'm going to be dealing with social influences and diving into each type of influence that our society is being attacked with from the perspective of the gender theory or ideology platform. So with that, let's get started. And let's talk about what is gender ideology. Let's start with that, because a lot of people hear the term, they're not really sure what it is, or gender theory. You might hear it called that as well. I'm going to use those interchangeably. So let's talk about that. And then where did it come from? What's the history behind it? Why has it gained such momentum in recent history? It seems like things have blown up over the past 10 years even in regard to gender theory and gender ideology. And then is it really legitimate? And what does the Bible say about it? That's the most important thing we want to talk about. And we need a good foundation to start from to build off of. So that's where we definitely want to start. So let's talk about Genesis 1:26 and 27. The Bible says, "And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. So God created man in his image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them." And at that point, I feel like I could just do a drop the mic, because that says it all right there. Two genders. The purpose of this two sexes or genders, I think gender and sex are really the same thing. They were up until recent history when they decided that they weren't the same. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the purpose of the two genders or sexes was to be fruitful and multiply. That's what God wanted us to do. And so they have a practical function. There's a practical function to the two different sexes. It's not a theory. It's not a feeling. There is a use for the two genders and two sexes. I like to jokingly say everybody knows what a hole in a pole is and how they work together. It's the same concept. So you have two poles or two holes, they don't really fit together. Everybody knows that. It's not natural. Natural is a pole in a hole. So I'm going to leave that right there. You can deduce from that what you want. In the end times, though, the Bible does talk about what we're experiencing right now in the culture. He talks about that one of the signs is going to be that he's going to give people over to uncleanness through lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, and that's found in Romans 1:24. He also says that he will give people over to vile affections, and it goes on to specifically say, "For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature, and likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly." Okay, unseemly there means unnatural. Again, you can find that in Romans 1:26 and 27. In addition to that, the Bible also warns about those who know the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death. And not only do they do the same, but they have pleasure in them that do them. Now, maybe you're not on the spectrum of LGBTQ. Maybe you're not in that role. But what do we hear a call for all the time? Allies, right? They want us to be allies. They push for that, even in the school systems. They want allies, even in workplaces, allies. So the Bible specifically addresses that when it says, not only do they do the same, but they have pleasure in them that do them. It's very clear. In biblical times, I want to touch on this a little bit because I think it's relevant in a weird way, so bear with me. In the Bible times, some chose to be eunuchs. Matthew 19:11 and 12, it says, "But he said unto them, all men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it's given. For there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there are eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake." Now, what is a eunuch? A eunuch is a male who's been castrated. So slide 1, Josh, please. And this is from Wikipedia. I know it's not a reliable source, but for some things, I think it's a decent one. A eunuch is simply a male who's been castrated, and there were different reasons why castration occurred. Typically, there was a social function to it. Some were slaves, and so it was forced upon them. Some were in the king's court, and so that was something that they just did. Some were born that way. So we're talking about possibly intersex, deformities, when they were made that way by other men or people. It could have been a punishment. It could have been part of the slavery. It could have been part of their job in the king's castle. Some were eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. In this, I wonder, and I'd be curious to know your thoughts, so please put a comment if you know. I wonder if those are the people that might have had tendencies towards a gay or lesbian lifestyle, and so they chose to make themselves eunuchs to keep from sinning, because the Bible's clear about not leaving the natural affection, not doing things that are outside of the function that he created us for. So I wonder about that, and I would love to know your thoughts. Let's look at slide 2. How did gender ideology come about? Don't you love that picture? This is Alfredkinsey. He's known as the father of the sexual revolution. In 1933, he became interested in sexual practices. In 1947, he started the Institute for Sex Research at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, which later was renamed to the Kinsey Institute and still is in operation today. He actually started it with funding from the Rockefeller Foundation. So the Rockefellers, if you know anything about our history, have always been involved in some really creepy, weird stuff along the way. They seem to gravitate towards things like this to put their money into. Apparently, they make a lot of money at it. Wink, wink. He wrote a book called The Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. In 1948, it was published. And then that was followed up by Sexual Behavior in the Human Female in 1953. These books then became curriculum in colleges and universities across the world. Let's look at slide 3. This is a little bit of information that you need to know about Alfredkinsey. He believed that children are sexual from birth, and he set out to prove it. So he actually wanted to do research studies about it. He performed studies using 200 boys under the age of 15 by observing sexual acts, recording them, hiring pedophiles to record their sexual activities with children. But I want to call your attention to table 34 in his book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, because this table alone should sicken you. I want you to look at the top. 5 months old is the age. Note the next column, number of orgasms. Note the next column, how much time was involved, and list it. That is how many times a 5-month-old had an orgasm in the designated time. Now, how did he get that information? I mean, look at the next one, 11 months old, another 11-month-old, 2-year-old, 2.5-year-old, 4-year-old, all the way up to 11 years old. No, 14 years old, sorry. These are children. They're all minors. He sought out prisoners that had been released that were put in prison for pedophilia. He specifically sought them out to reach out to them to get them to log their sexual data with children for his so-called study. Now, how did he get away with that illegal activity? It's because he called it research and classified it as a study. He was, again, approaching it from a perspective of children are sexual from birth. Then he sought to prove it. Typically in science, you have a theory or a hypothesis, and you're actually testing it. So you're not going at it from a point of trying to prove it necessarily. You're open to whatever the outcome is. So he kind of did it in a reverse way. He also was involved in starting Playboy with Hugh Hefner. Hugh Hefner loved Alfredkinsey and followed him and became like a mentee. So Alfredkinsey mentored him and helped him start Playboy. Another thing that Kinsey believed was that chastity is impossible. Now I want you to think about that. This is why he believed children are sexual from birth. He believed chastity is absolutely impossible. And his ideology led to the creation of siecus. If you watched the last episode of the show, you learned about Castle and siecus. Alfredkinsey was key in starting siecus because the woman that actually founded it was a follower of Alfredkinsey. I want you to think about that impact. If you don't recall and you don't know what siecus is, it's basically the organization. It's an organization that the schools use as an authority to define and teach comprehensive sex ed in schools. So keep that in mind. So someone who believed children are sexual from birth, who believed that chastity is impossible, was the person, the inspiration for creating siecus, which is used in schools. That's going to explain a lot if you just think about that alone. The Kinsey Institute, again, is still in operation at IU, Indiana University in Bloomington, and they actually have an app for the phone called the Kinsey Reporter. I actually have it installed on my phone because I use it to show people. They capture data from people around the world who would log it in this app, and you pick a different age group when you log sexual encounters and sexual details. And one of the categories is youth. And if I recall correctly, I think the other one is very young. So there's actually 2 categories for minors, and you can log your information. Now, I then can use the app and pull up a map of the world and see the pins for all the locations where these people have logged data. And I can go and look at the reports. It's still being done. Let's look at slide 4. Now we're going to move to Johnmoney. Johnmoney was influenced by Kinsey's works as well. And he was a professor at Johns Hopkins University. He was known for his work on human sexual behavior and gender. He believed that gender was separate from sex and that it could be manipulated within the first 2 years of birth. He believed it was a learned behavior as opposed to being innate. And he was the first one to present this theory. So with Johnmoney, it's like a light bulb went off. He just thought this up and he presented it. Isn't it funny how that often happens? We have examples all throughout history where somebody has some bright idea, or it can be a very helpful idea It can be a very destructive idea, but then people just kind of jump on it. Evolution was from Darwin's theory. Okay. It was a theory. It wasn't fact. Hasn't still been fully proven at all, but people just kind of gravitate towards these things. And once they make it into academia, then it's like they're solid. They have a standing, they have roots, they take root in society and they grow. And you have to just constantly be using your critical thinking skills and be aware that that happens, and go back and make sure you're not just following something that was just something somebody thought in their head. He established the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic in 1965. His work included working with patients, medical transitions, and trying to influence culture by destroying stereotypes. His clinic actually started performing reassignment surgeries in 1966 as the first clinic to do it. Now, something we talked about before, we're exposing all this stuff. Again, I'm not telling you anything other people probably aren't already talking about. And I know for a fact some of them are on different podcasts and different events and different speaking engagements. This isn't new information, but I might just have a different audience than they have. And so the point is to spread it, to get it out into the public knowledge base, because we just have gone along all this time. And I don't know about you, but when I realized all these things happened, and then I started looking at how far back it goes, I feel like I was living in an alternate state, an alternate universe, because I had no idea that all of these things had been going on for so long in our history. Well before my lifetime. I don't know about you, but well before my lifetime. So it's shocking, and it makes me even more angry, because how did we not know? How were we so asleep? How did they pull this off? The communist goals, read into the congressional record in 1963. How did that happen? And people then subsequently forgot about it? Was it even news back then? I know we didn't have the internet. I know we didn't have the same news sources, but it was read into the congressional records. So that tells me that it already had some traction somewhere. What happened to us? Did we just all fall asleep? So that's the point of these shows. I want to just kind of point these things out and make you aware. There was a family called the Reimer family. There were two twins, a set of twins born into the Reimer family. They were both boys. There was Brian and Bruce. When they went for circumcision, Bruce's was destructive to his genitals. Something happened. The equipment didn't work correctly, and it deformed him. And so his family was devastated by this, totally devastated by this, and didn't really know how to handle it. And they found out about Johnmoney and his work at Johns Hopkins, because they looked for resources. And so they became patients with Johnmoney. When they were 22 months old, Bruce had his testicles removed via surgery, and Johnmoney told the family to rear him as a female. So his name was changed to Brenda at that point. He was put on hormones at John's directive, and his family proceeded to raise him as a female. Female clothes, female toys, female everything. Now, I want to stop there for a minute, because somehow we have arrived at the point where there's this whole general idea that girls like pink and dolls and boys like trucks and blue. And I kind of touched on this before. Where did that come from? Because it certainly didn't come from Christianity or religion. It didn't come from the Bible. God never said those things. Where do you think it came from? It came from society. It came from academia. It came from psychology. It came from people labeling that, creating that stereotype. Edward Bernays. Okay. Gotcha. That's Josh. Love him. we'll have to talk about that, get the background on that. Bottom line is that wasn't something that was biblical. It wasn't a Christian thing. It wasn't anything like that. Guarantee you that back in the 1800s, when before women worked outside the home, there was a lot of getting dirty for females back then. A lot of getting dirty. They did a lot of heavy work too. I know when I was growing up, I was what would be known as a tomboy. We don't seem to have that anymore. I liked being out in the barn with my dad. I liked being out on the horse and the motorcycle and the snowmobile. I didn't want to be in the house cooking, cleaning, doing all those domestic things. My mom tried to get me to crochet, and I was like, no, not having it. I didn't like any of those girly things. I did, however, like purses, shoes, makeup, and clothes. I did go that far. But outside of that, I was pretty much outside all the time with the kids in my neighborhood. Didn't matter if they were boys or girls, we're running around playing and doing all the things, getting dirty. So if I were growing up today, I feel strongly probably that they would have told me I was probably transgender, and I would have been rushed down that path that they like to rush everybody down. Back to the story. John went on to continue seeing the boys as his patients. Here's where it gets really disgusting and makes me want to just throat punch him if you were around. He forced them to watch and view pornography and perform sexual acts at age 6 on each other. He photographed the acts. He forced them to perform genital inspections on each other. Now, Bruce was very uncomfortable with that. By this point, they had renamed him Brenda. He never adjusted to female toys, female clothes, female stereotypical things. He never did. He never had an affinity for it. He always felt like he was a boy. This comes out later in his own testimony. Think about those children at age 6 being forced to do these things to each other. And from what I understand from the testimony from Bruce / Brenda / David, we'll learn about that in a minute, Johnmoney would get so angry if the boys wouldn't comply. He was really, really slick in front of the parents, but behind closed doors, he was very firm with these boys and forcing them to do these things. Bruce was finally told about his gender, his true gender, at age 14. At that point, he chose to change his name to David. So we got Bruce / Brenda / David. He had surgeries actually to reverse the female modifications that were done to him. In 1997, he was interviewed and he told his whole story. His brother, Brian, committed suicide in 2002. And then David / Bruce committed suicide in 2004. Coincidentally, Johnmoney also saw pedophilia as normal. If you've been paying any attention in the culture, we have a push now of momentum towards normalizing pedophilia. It started with this gender theory, and now it's moving into the pedophilia stage. Minor attracted persons, or MAPS, is a word they chose to call themselves as something that didn't have a stigma tied to it. But that is going on. So you can see there's seriously a connection between Kinsey and money, and at least in their views about children. So that's kind of the history up to the 1950s, maybe some 60s also with the boys. Let's look at what could possibly be behind this whole push. Because we've got Kinsey, who somehow became famous. His textbooks were distributed worldwide and used in colleges and universities everywhere. He starts Playboy with Hugh Hefner. He influences Johnmoney to go into this gender theory with this bright idea. He also influenced the woman who founded siecus. So are you seeing all these connections? There's just all these different things going on, again, with the Rockefeller money behind it. How do you root cause it? Like, where is it from exactly? Well, let's go back to the communist goals, again, read into the congressional record in 63. We're going to look at slide 5, which is the communist goals 25 and 26. 25 says break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. Number 26, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. Slide 6, please. Goal number 32, support any socialist movement to give centralized control over any part of the culture, education, social agencies, welfare programs, mental health clinics, etc. There you have your mental health and social agencies. Slide 7, please. Communist Goal 39, dominate the psychiatric profession and use mental health laws as a means of gaining coercive control over those who oppose communist goals. So are you starting to see how this all fits together? The communist goals that I'm promoting here were actually taken from a book called The Naked Communist. It was written by a guy who was anti-communist, but these goals did not come from him. They were introduced well before he wrote them into the book, which was then subsequently read into the congressional record. So this all is about the same time. If you go back and figure out the time frames, it all is lining up as around the same time. Ironically, I also want to mention both alfredkinsey and johnmoney were raised in Christian homes. Their parents were faithful Christians. Think about that for a minute. How did they go from, being reared in a Christian home to the degeneracy that they became? Slide 8. This is something from the American College of Pediatricians. They actually are the author of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-5 as it's referred to. There are subsequent versions after this that have come out, but I want to point out what these things do. So these things that Johnmoney promoted and put these boys on, hormone blockers, the female surgeries, things like that. I want to dive into that. According to the ACP, puberty blockers cause depression and other emotional disturbances related to suicide. Cross-sex hormones may disrupt mental health. It's talking about testosterone for men or estrogen for women. It's talking about pubertal children diagnosed with gender dysphoria may be given puberty blockers as young as 11 and will require cross-sex hormones in later adolescence to continue impersonating the opposite sex. These children will never be able to conceive any genetically related children, even via artificial reproductive technology. Did you hear that? According to the ACP, they will become infertile. It goes on to say, in addition, cross-sex hormones are associated with dangerous health risks, including but not limited to cardiac disease, high blood pressure, blood clots, strokes, diabetes, and cancer. Who is telling our kids this? We have kids being rushed into gender affirmation care en masse in this country. We have no questions asked. They're being prescribed hormones within 15 minutes of seeing a school counselor or a licensed counselor about this. No questions asked. Why? Why are we rushing them into this when these are possible side effects most likely to occur? We need to figure that out. Why is our culture so hell-bent on doing this? Now, I'm glad to say that European countries, Denmark, Finland, even England, have pulled back on this gender affirmative care. by rushing kids into this. They're actually pulling back because, you know why? Because we're told all the time that these kids need this or they're going to commit suicide. Would you rather have a live daughter or a dead son, right? We hear these things in our culture all the time. This is something the psychiatric field uses to weaponize this, to push the gender ideology and theory onto these kids and adults. Mostly I care about the kids because as adults, you do you. I don't care. I care about the kids. Why are they doing this? Why is it that Europe is actually figuring out that kids are more suicidal after the gender affirmative care when they try to detransition? Because guess what? They've grown a little bit and matured a little bit, and they no longer feel like they need to be that. They don't feel like that other gender anymore. They outgrew it. I'm going to also tell you this happens mostly around puberty. Ask yourself this. Do you know any women who are happy they were in puberty? Do you know any women who embraced it and just absolutely loved it and were so excited about it? I don't. I challenge you to find somebody. And if you find somebody, hey, put it in the comments and tell me you found somebody. Because I guarantee you're going to have a really hard time finding females who embrace puberty. Ironically, female to male gender transition is the most percentage. Well, gee, I wonder why. Thanks, Eve, for the curses you put on us that we don't want to go through. It's horrible. It's horrible. And I, for one, cried for a very long time when that time came because I didn't want it. I didn't like it. I didn't want anything to do with it. I'm telling you, I'm not alone. And unfortunately, I feel like we're extorting these kids. We're going to talk about some reasons why a little bit. For right now, let's look at slide 9. There is a doctor, Dr. Julia Mason, and another Dr. Ericaanderson that did an interview together. They are on a mission to fight against the push for kids into gender theory, gender ideology, and transitioning. They're hugely opponents of it. According to them, hormone blockers do the following: decrease bone density, affect sexual attraction, loss of IQ points. I want you to think about that one. If given to girls who have already had a period, it throws them into violent menopause. And I can tell you from the interview they did, they're not talking about just menopause. When they say violent menopause, they mean it. And then loss of ability to achieve orgasm. Do you want that for your daughter? Do you really want that for your daughter? Do you want that for your granddaughter? Really? What about your son and grandson? I don't understand. The evidence is out there now. When this first came out, there wasn't a lot of evidence. It's just like clinical trials. They have to do the trial to figure out what's wrong with it, okay? Long-term observational phase 4 studies are not required for approval by the FDA or the MHRA or anything else, any other regulatory body. Therefore, it gets approved and then they continue to track it to find out what the adverse events are and if there's drug interaction issues with other pharmaceutical products. Because guess what? When they do pharma trials, they don't go at it to test any drug interactions. The only way they know about them is if one of the patients in the control group or in the study happened to be on something and then took this trial drug and then had an adverse reaction to it. That's the only way they know. So it's the same with this. When it first came out, we didn't know the long-term effects. In fact, the two drugs, and I'll bring this up later, that are used for hormone blockers were not intended to be hormone blockers. Did you know that? We're using these off-label, which means for a use that we found might be beneficial, that wasn't the intended use for the clinical indication of the drugs. Okay? So it's like a good side effect. And we just go whole hog on it and say, oh, look, it seems to be like a good thing, so let's try it more. And we can just start using it like that. I don't get it. Slide 10. Here's another one. According to Dr. paulmchugh, which is the former psychiatrist in chief at Johns Hopkins University, ironically where Johnmoney was, said studies from Vanderbilt University and London's Portman Clinic of children who had expressed transgender feelings, but for whom over time, 70 to 80% spontaneously lost those feelings. 70 to 80% grew out of it, in other words. The transgendered person's disorder is in the person's assumption that they are different than the physical reality of their body, their maleness or femaleness, as assigned by nature. It is a disorder similar to a dangerously thin person suffering anorexia who looks in the mirror and thinks they're overweight. If gender behaviors are on a spectrum, then who decided that boys like trucks and girls like pink and dolls, right? We talked about that. Children can exhibit behaviors that may not fit into the two rigid boxes, but that does not mean they're a different gender. Who made the boxes? That's the question, isn't it? Who made those boxes? You talked about that. What's his name? Edward Bernays. Okay, that's more research I have to do. Or maybe Josh should be an interviewee and talk about it. Thank you. Okay. Now we're going to move on to the National Library of Medicine, slide 11. This is a study that was done by Translational Andrology and Urology in 2019. And it demonstrates that transgender individuals who undergo medical or surgical therapies for gender are at risk for infertility. They actually found that. They go on to say in the abstract that quote, the transgender population faces many barriers to care, such as provider discrimination, lack of information, legal barriers, scarcity of fertility centers, financial burden, and emotional cost, unquote. So they're basically saying that their study showed that these patients became infertile from these treatments. But it's interesting that they go on to say the difficulties these people reach in trying to mitigate that, like lack of information, legal barriers, financial burden, emotional costs, provider discrimination. So they don't always have the care they need. But I'm of the opinion when they do have the care they need, these people are not telling them the risks. All right? They're not telling them. And per the Helsinki Declaration, informed consent is a thing. Anytime, just using the pharma industry as an example, anytime you're in a trial and you're taking a trial medication, you're supposed to be given an informed consent. And that tells you what the known risks are at that point. But we're not doing that for these kids. In fact, if you've ever had an inclination, go to Reddit, the app Reddit, and search for detrans. Read through that thread and the comments on those threads, because people are all the time posting on there, why didn't anybody tell me this? Now I'm never going to get my voice back. I didn't know that. Why did I not know that? So many different health issues they're going through as detrans, now that they've outgrown the gender confusion and dysphoria, that cannot be fixed, and they're desperate for information about it. Why was I not told? Why was I not informed? Why didn't anybody warn me about this? Why? Because we have gender affirmation as our concept of how we handle gender dysphoria. And that means you come in and you even express not even a definitive, I think I'm the wrong gender. It doesn't even have to be definitive. You just say you're uncomfortable and you name some things that you're uncomfortable with. If they interpret that to be gender dysphoria, they will rush you through to hormone treatment, puberty blockers, even surgeries, whatever they need to rush you through to. That's the thing that's wrong with it. Why would we do that? Why can't they do an assessment? Why can't they work with you to work through something that's uncomfortable like gender dysphoria? Why does it have to be, oh my gosh, they said the key words, they said the perfect words, we have to rush them in? Stop the insanity. Some of the risks, again, just to go over this again: sexual reproduction damage, general health issues, infertility, emotional damage, and possible suicide. And according to that ACP, the American College ACP, the rates of suicide are nearly 20 times greater among the adults who use cross-sex hormones and undergo sex reassignment surgery, even in Sweden, which was among the most LGBTQ affirming countries. Sorry, American College of Pediatrics. Got it. Did you catch that? Rates of suicide are 20 times greater among adults who use cross-sex hormones and undergo reassignment surgery. 20 times greater. But we're being lied to because the industry is telling us that's not true. The industry in America is sticking with gender affirmation care, rushing them through the process, get them in, no stops, no barriers, just rush them through. And then using that weaponization tactic with parents by saying, would you rather have a happy daughter or a dead son? Using that as a weapon. Everything we do is because of an agenda. Every decision we make aligns with an agenda. It may not be a conscious thing. It may be subconscious, but everything we do is intentional. We make decisions all the time. It might be split-second decisions, but decisions. So again, let's talk about what the agenda is behind this. I'm going to play a couple of videos for you. Well, actually, Josh is going to. Thank you, Josh. And I just want you to kind of absorb this, take this in. The first one is Bill Gates from 13 years ago. Let's roll.
This is a very important question to get right, because it was absolutely key for me. When our foundation first started up, it was focused on reproductive health. That was the main thing we did, because I thought, population growth in poor countries is the biggest problem they face. You've got to help mothers who want to limit family size have the tools and education to do that. And I thought that's the only thing that really counts. Well, then I came across articles that showed that the key thing you can do to reduce population growth is actually improve health. And that sounds paradoxical. You think, okay, better health means more kids, not less kids. Well, in fact, what parents are doing is they're trying to have 2 kids survive to adulthood to take care of them. And so the more disease burden there is, the more kids they have that high probability. So there's a perfect correlation that as you improve health, within a half generation, the population growth rate goes down. In fact, Hans Rosling here at this conference, in 2 of my favorite speeches, actually showed that unbelievable correlation that population growth has gone down. Today, where is there high population growth? It's in the places with the worst health conditions, northern Nigeria, northern India. And so the 2 problems go exactly hand in hand. If we improve health rapidly, we will get the peak population to be as much as 1 billion below the current expected peak. That is about 8.3 billion versus 9.3.
Thanks, Josh. A couple of things about that. So in the prior episodes, we talked about the United Nations. We talked about the sustainability goals. Sustainability goals include eradicating poverty, right? Include health across the world, include all these different things. Did you catch that he talked about population being reduced through healthcare in impoverished nations. Okay, let's think this through for a minute. What does that have to do with gender ideology? What does it have to do with gender affirmation? Transgender affirmation, actually. If you have someone, an entity, who wants to depopulate the world because of climate change or mankind's impact on the environment, talking about, I call it the environmental cult, because it's fine to be careful and caring about your environment. That's one thing. When you're an activist with it and you live it and you embrace it and you preach it and you're willing to die for it, that's a whole different story. That's really kind of a religion. But Bill Gates Foundation, remember we talked about how it's linked to the United Nations, right? It's one of the partners with the United Nations. They have always been one that aligns with Agenda 2030, talking about, again, eradicating poverty, equity for all, financial security, healthcare, improved healthcare, and all those sound very, very good and virtuous on the surface. But again, if you think the earth is being destroyed by humans and there's overpopulation that's using up all our resources all the time and we don't have enough resources and we're going to run out of food and we're going to run out of water, and literally a local pharma company, I worked on a software piece for them where they were saying and promoting and marketing that we were going to run out of food by 2050 across the world, 2050. So they came up with a product that you give a cow and it makes them produce more, like a quarter of a cup of more milk per day, and that was going to help solve the starvation across the world. If you do come from the place where there's too many people, too much impact on the environment, and you want to reduce the population, what's a very good way to do it? If giving hormones to kids, puberty blockers to kids, transgender surgeries to people, all of these different therapies makes you infertile, what happens to our population? It's interesting, isn't it? Because I've said all along, the Sustainable Development Goals are all linked together. They're cross-pollinated. There's 17 of them, but every time you look at one, it touches on other things that are other goals. They just merge them all together. This is a case where I believe that's happening. That's the reason for the push. That's the reason for rushing through the transgender affirmation process. That's the reason for getting them on hormones within 15 minutes of a visit with a clinician. That has to be it. I don't know of any other thing. Put it in the comments if you know of any other reason why we would be so hell-bent on doing this to kids. Put it in there, and I will consider it for sure. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I don't care. But I have thought through all of this so much, and that is one major reason, if not the only reason, I can come up with for why the push. And Bill Gates talked about it there. He was talking about reducing poverty. He talked about reducing population, right? That's a thing. He's been on tape on other videos, which I couldn't find before this show, but he's been on videos before talking about how we need to reduce the population. Okay. Another way to do it is something we went through in, 2020, 2021, 2022, just saying. That's another way. But if they are hell-bent that we have too many people and too much population, this is a good way to get rid of it. Good way to reduce it. Let's go with the second video. This is Jane Goodall from 6 years ago.
You have some thoughts about population as a driver beneath all of these things that we're talking about. What should be done about population?
For a long time, it was considered politically incorrect to even mention it. And most of the big conservation organizations refused to mention it. But I always thought, I mean, you see what happens. In the old days, there were cultures in a lot of these indigenous people, and you had lots of children because they looked after you in your old age and you shared out the land. But now it's different, and they know it's different. And that's why there were bare hills all around Gombe. So we've introduced in our program, we've introduced family planning, so welcomed by the people because they know that things are different. And of course, this administration is cutting family planning around the developing world, which is terrifying to me. And so if you approach family planning right, it's something that's very, very important. And when it was considered politically incorrect to mention it, and I was determined to mention it, I decided to call it voluntary population optimization. So by the time people worked it out.
And research shows educating girls is one of the smartest things.
I meant to say that, yes, indeed. Women's education, empowering women, and scholarships to keep girls in school beyond puberty. Family size then tends to drop worldwide, indeed.
Jane Goodall was with the United Nations. I don't know if you caught that. Manager of peace or something. Again, it's the same kind of concept as what Bill Gates was saying. I don't know if you noticed the similarities. Again, they're both talking about kind of the same thing. Depopulating, so at least reducing population based on healthcare and education. Most of it has to do with comprehensive sex ed. They think that by educating these people on proper sexual practices, although, again, comprehensive sex ed isn't your mom and dad's sex ed. It is everything under the sun and then some. They're talking about, again, there's a link to the poverty sustainability goal, right? Because both of them mentioned the poorer countries, and they're the ones having the most kids. Again, they're cross-pollinating with the reducing poverty because they're talking about educating them so that the family structure reduces, the number of family members reduces over time, thus causing depopulation, thus causing less use of resources in our environment, thus causing a reduction in emissions and addressing climate change. It's all tied together, I'm telling you. You start going down the rabbit hole and it's all tied together. In addition to that, less population means less people to manage and control, and I'm just going to say that and move on. Another thing that I want to talk about that's a reason for this push is big pharma. There's an article in the New York Post in August of 2020, and it's titled, "Gender Ideology is a Boon to Big Pharma and a Threat to Parental Rights." Now, mind you, 2020 this was written. They say, and I can't even pronounce this really, medroxyprogesterone acetate, a common drug in gender-affirming therapy, has long been used to chemically castrate sex offenders. I'm having a struggle talking tonight. I think our administration's rubbing off, I'm telling you. You horse-faced pony soldier, you. Anyways, they're talking about this drug is actually used, and remember I was talking about off-label uses, so the original intention of this drug, that's a hormone therapy drug for transgenderism being used in transgender people, was to chemically castrate sex offenders. That makes them infertile, that makes them sterile, okay? That was the original intention of it, but we're using it as an off-label use. Now, what do you think is going to happen to kids that are on it, even adults that are on it, young adults, and they're not being told? Another one is Lupron, and it's a hormone blocker. AbbVie, the manufacturer, made $726 million in 2018 alone off of Lupron. Do you think money's not behind this? Money was behind the thing that happened in 2020, 2021, and 2022. What makes us think that's not what's driving this as well? Lisa Littman is a physician scientist at Brown University. She points out that children put on these drugs are lifelong patients in need of the drugs. And she feels it's due to a social contagion among peers. So that's two parts that I want to dive into with her and what she said. One, did you catch that? They're lifelong patients. These drug manufacturing companies are due to get a child or an adult, young adult, whatever, on these drugs, get them through maybe reassignment surgery. There's another money market. And once they're on these hormones, they can't go off of them for the rest of their lives. You know how much money that is? It's a lot. Let's look at slide 12. This table is from the National Institute of Health. It's from fall of 2022. I just want to point out the cost per person for each procedure. It is outrageous. So you can see across the top, they have different procedures for transgenderism, transgender surgeries. And then I've underlined the per person cost for each one of those. And I just want you to think about, look at those numbers and think about how much that money is coming in. It's incredible. I'm sure the costs have gone up since then as well. Because again, this is from fall of 2022. Can't find anything more recent. It's outrageous. The pharma industry just makes so much money off of this. Now I want to move a little bit to another cause or correlation. I actually think it's a correlation. We don't know that it's a cause yet, but let's look at slide 13. Did you know that approximately 1 to 2% of the population is estimated to meet criteria for the autism spectrum disorders, about twice higher in men than women? The potential link between ASD and gender dysphoria was noted by researchers as early as 1981 when they noticed that 10% of 30 children with a clinical diagnosis of autism had trouble answering a gender identity question, meaning, are you a little boy or a little girl? That fewer than 1% of neurotypical children of the same age struggle with. Did you see that? 10% struggle with that question. A number of case reports describing individual cases of people presenting with both gender dysphoria and autism spectrum traits followed. But it wasn't until then, it wasn't until the 2010s that more systematic research on this topic began to emerge. Since then, at least 9 larger scale studies have been published in the medical and psychological literature spanning several Western countries, blah, blah, blah. The point I want to make there again is that 10% of children on the autism spectrum disorder scale could not answer that question about gender identity. Why am I telling you that? Because I have a personal story that's related to this. I lived it with a family member, and the family member was labeled as a child. They kept trying to label them as, first it was ADD, then it was autism, then it was Asperger's. So the schools just kept trying to label this kid. The kid had some autistic behavioral tendencies, but thought it was more like OCD than anything. At age 27, this kid decided to transition. It didn't make any sense at the time. Never had any issues before that. But I believe that because of the tendencies with the ASD aspect, that did play a part in it for this particular kid. Because I thought about this before I ever saw this article. If you ask somebody on the ASD spectrum if they're a boy or a girl, they're typically very black and white about stuff in their thinking, very technical thinkers in black and white. And that question is too vague for them. They don't know how to answer it. They can't define it, therefore they can't answer it. Well, it seems to me that we are rushing these kids through this gender theory program, this gender ideology, and we're trying to trans them because we don't understand where they're coming from. Instead of addressing and getting on their level, we're expecting them to just go with the flow. On forbes.com, there's another article. Science has found a correlation between gender dysphoria and the autism spectrum disorder. And note that it's not showing causation, but correlation. And remember, I said that earlier. This is from an article called Growing Evidence for a Link Between Gender Dysphoria and Autism Spectrum Disorders. You'll find all these links below. I encourage you to go read them. Do your own study. Don't listen to me until you figure out that I know what I'm talking about, and then come listen to me. You're welcome to do it then. and not because I'm special. I just put a lot of time and effort into this and have some good resources to reach out to on it. Let's look at slide 14. This is from the UK. It's an article on autistic individuals are more likely to be LGBTQ. In their article, they state, the study found that autistic adults and adolescents are approximately 8 times more likely to identify as asexual and other sexualities than their other non-autistic peers. And there were sex differences in sexual orientation. Autistic males are 3.5 times more likely to identify as bisexual than non-autistic males, whereas autistic females are 3 times more likely to identify as homosexual than non-autistic females. You seeing a trend here? There's something going on with that. And again, I feel like it's extortion of these kids that are struggling with mental issues already. And we're just taking advantage of it. And for what? Money? Depopulation? Sustainable development goals? I mean, take your pick. It could be all of it. According to the University of Cambridge, there's significant differences in sexual behavior on those of those on the autism spectrum. But there's so much more to do with these studies. What I want to do next is I want to walk you through social influences that we see in our culture that are pushing our kids in this direction. This LGBTQ plus direction, the transgender obviously is part of that. I want to dive into that because you can't fight something unless you acknowledge it first and you're aware of it. And that's the point of this. We have to become aware. We have to become knowledgeable about these things in order to stand up and fight against them. I don't know what I could possibly do besides, I talk about on the shows, call your representatives, run for office, whatever. Outside of that, I'm not sure what else to do myself because we're so far gone with these things. The only hope I can think of is enough people become aware of this and enough people actually train and teach their kids to basically fight against these things that are in our culture. And eventually the youth will be on the right path. That's a big hope that I have. If you have kids and grandkids, what I want to do is push out some information to you about social influences so you can talk to your kids about it and then confront them about it and then teach them the right way to view these things and what's wrong with them if you feel that way. But I just want to give you the ammo, essentially. I want to give you the ammunition to do that. So the next time we're going to talk about one thing in particular that's close to my heart that I've been doing a lot of research on. And it has to do with a subculture that we see that's becoming more and more prevalent. We're talking about conventions, furries, anime and manga influences, all kinds of things that are in that subculture that could be influencing your kids and grandkids and you don't even know it. I thought anime and manga were cartoons and comic books. I had no idea what was in them until the past 3 years when I started digging in and researching. And I want to share with you what I found because I see other podcasters mention it briefly. I don't see them diving into it on a deep level at all. And I want to give you again the ammunition so that you know what actually is going on in these spaces so that you can fight against it and protect your kids and your grandkids. Again, if you're an adult and you're into it, I don't care. That's not the point. But everybody should be aware of these things because they are influencing our society, especially starting with our youth. And our only hope is the youth at this point. Remember John 10:10. The thief cometh not, but for to steal, kill, and destroy. Christ said, I'm come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. We're not trying to always stay negative and talk about all the negative things. Again, these first several episodes are foundational and things that I think need to be laid out as a foundation to build on later. There's going to come a point when these are going to become more fun. I promise you that. But these topics that are foundational are so deep and so serious that I don't think there's a lot of room for fun. There's just too much content to talk to you about. So stay tuned and keep tuning in because, again, at some point, I promise it's going to get better. But right now, we need to know our enemy. And we need to know his tactics. And we need to know his tools. Because we're in a spiritual battle and we need to be able to fight. Ephesians 6:12 and 13, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. Rulers of the darkness of this world. Against spiritual wickedness in high places. So we're not talking about, you and I necessarily, our level, but when it talks about high places and rulers of the darkness of this world, I believe that's talking about government entities, the highest level of rulers in this world. I believe it has to do with that. So again, how do you fight it if you don't know about it? That's the point. I'm not anti-government, by the way. I'm going to make that very clear. God sets up governments and he tears down governments, and we're to obey authority as long as it doesn't conflict with God's laws. Okay? So I'm not anti-government. I'm not anything on the far right or anything like that. In fact, I'm an independent voter. I'm going to put that out there too. I reserve my independence when it comes to that. But I am somebody who can be a messenger to tell you and warn you about things that are going on. Our government in this country, when it was founded, was fantastic. Best system in the whole world and in the whole history of the world. Over the past few decades, we've kind of veered off the path a little bit. And I want it back. I'm not trying to take us back 100 years like, the left likes to claim. Although I will say, I don't know, in the time I was growing up, things were a lot better than they are now. Across the board, I think. Doesn't matter your race. It doesn't matter your color, anything, your sex, gender, whatever you want to call it. None of that mattered. We were kind to each other back then. The majority of people on my street, at least, went to church. They were people of faith. Not all the same faith. I'm not even saying that. But I think we didn't have to lock our doors at night. We didn't have to lock our cars everywhere we went. We didn't have to worry about somebody stealing out of our cars. Today, there was a shooting and a fatality in a front yard on a very busy street over by where I live. Within minutes of that, there was another shooting a block north of there. And then there was a girl on the highway here, 465, who was shot at in her car because she honked at a car that pulled in front of her and cut her off. I mean, that didn't happen when I was growing up. I'm sorry, it didn't. So I'm just saying, if we could go back to a time like that where everybody kind of got along, we all got along. We had friends of all different kinds. Granted, now I will tell you there's a lot more diversity. There is in my everyday life, and I embrace it and love that. But I don't think we should have the divisiveness, because when you're talking about Christian principles, it's the same for everybody. Be kind to one another. I mean, it's not hard. So anyways, there's just a lot fewer Christians nowadays. And what can we Christians do? Again, engage, study, start a local group, pray for the leadership, pray for me while you're at it. I could use it. Get to know your local politicians, run for office. These are all things that I'm going to bring up every single week, because when we're in a spiritual war, we're in a spiritual battle in this country for the soul of this country. Those are all things that I think can be done. And again, we still have a small chance to turn things around, but we're getting so close, folks, to where it's beyond fixing. We have to dig our heels in now. And we have to unite, and we have to be active and stand up for what's right. If we don't, who will? With that, I'm going to tell you, if you like this content, you want to see more and keep watching the episodes, be sure to subscribe. Hit the like, hit the notification bell, and subscribe to all episodes. Share. Share with your friends and family. And I would love it if you would post comments, because I love to read them. I've seen several come through already. We're on Rumble, we're on YouTube, different platforms. And so I'm loving the comments, so keep them coming. And I want to say again, special thank you to Revolver Broadcasting and Josh Cummins for being the second greatest producer. And that's a personal joke. Sterling is the perfect producer, so we can't have two perfect producers, but Josh is right up there. If you have a minute, please check out revolverbroadcasting.com, the website, and look at all the different content there. We have a lot of different shows and a lot of different podcasts and shorts, and it's a really fun place to go. So be sure to check it out. And with that, I'm signing off. Good night.